Hi, Bob Fornell here to talk to you about four types of code. These are four types of code as I perceive them. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about me. Bob Fornell, husband, father, senior solutions developer, leading edge. Been writing code for about 40 years. Most recently, front end I've been doing for about the last 12 years. And, um, those of you that know me or have watched some of my other videos, you get a lot about me, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. I want to get into what these four types of code are. Most of this has come about in my understanding of refactoring, restructuring code, making small transformations. These transformations lead to the same functionality. I've had conversations with different folks about this. In some of these conversations, I've started to explain why I write the code the way I do. And, is it a side project that might go somewhere? Is it a deep dive into code that I'm never going to reuse? Am I on a site like Code Wars where I'm trying to get the fastest code or the shortest code? Am I on a team working with a front end and I want to write code that developers without my skill set or without my depth of skill can still work with the code? Is there a little bit of testing in the project or a lot of testing in the project? Is this application something that has to be highly performant, fast? And all of these lead to different types, and I think they break down into four simple categories. So the four types of code are really simple. We have the shortest code, least lines, least number of characters, fastest code, which is basically is very similar to shortest in most cases, but very efficient. Okay, testable code, easy to write unit tests against that code. And then readable, easy for other developers to reason about. Okay, and I think these four are important in terms of showing us that you don't always have to have that shortest. You don't always have to have the fastest. If you're writing code that's short and extremely fast, but it is hard to reason about, hard to understand, then it becomes very challenging. And when you look at the different dimensions that we use here to rate code, they're quite often in opposition to each other. You'll get two or three, but rarely going to get all of them. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples here. So the baseline code that I'm going to use here sets up an array. Okay, so we have this work array. We have a makeID function that takes a length, and it loops over that length and creates a result, which is a random set of characters. Okay, so if you look at what we're doing here, we're picking from the letters A to Z, upper lowercase 0 to 9, and we're making an ID, okay, of that length. Okay, and then we return that. So then in the next loop, we're looping through 100 million times. We're randomly generating a length up to 20, and we're creating an object with a username with a make ID of whatever that length is. It is possible some of these are going to be 0. It's possible they're going to be higher than that. We push that new object onto the array. So we're creating a really big array. Okay, and I want this because we do need to look at speed and things like that. So baseline code. So let's look at shortest and testable. And yes, we can make them a little bit shorter. So if you look at that first one, all have username 1. If that variable were A, that's short. We're accessing the work array. We're using the every. And then we've got a function in there that looks at the item length. Can we reduce that with variable naming? Absolutely. Okay. I just want to show this is one of the shorter routes we can go. Testable. How do we make that testable? Well, we pull that item arrow function out and make it its own function. So down below here you see the has username, where we're passing in an item and it returns is that length greater than 0. Okay, that is passed into the every. That function gets passed into the every on all have username 2. Okay, it's not quite as short as the other one. It's pretty close. But it also becomes really testable because I can pass a fake has username into the all have username 2. I can pass a couple of different options into as items into has username. In fact, I really only need two. I need an empty one and I need one with a value, right? I might look at things like, hey, do we actually have username as an attribute on the object? In which case we'd see we have a flaw in that logic at that level. Okay, the assumption here is that username is always there. We get into fastest code. Now here I say this is part 1 because we're going to look at speeds here in a few minutes. So all have username 3. Fastest. One of the things I've found over time is the traditional for loop in JavaScript is one of the fastest. Okay. And notice what we do here. You know, one of the things I want to point out is in that for loop we're setting let I equal 0, comma, len equals work.length. Those two assignments only happen the first time through the for loop. So I don't have to check the work length every time. So I is less than len in the next part of the for loop in our comparison. I don't have to check that length of the array every time, which would slow things down slightly, especially with 100 million records. Okay, we've got a simple if in there that breaks out. So we're going to drop out if our 0 element is earlier on in the array. Again, faster. We want to drop out of the for loop as fast as we can and return a value. Okay. Readable code. Okay, here we've done a work.forEach, passing in an item. It's not much different than the for loop, although things are condensed down a little bit. We can't bail out of a for each, so it's going to be a little bit slower, depending on where a 0 element might be for the username. But it's more readable. This is easier to understand what's going on. So we have all have username. We're setting a value of have. We're looping through each. If the length is equal to 0, have gets set to false. At the end of that process, we return that Boolean variable have. Readable. Okay? Easier to reason about than the other 3 versions we've looked at. So I did say the fastest code has a part 2. Okay, so the question is it the fastest? So what I did in the terminal is I ran a console.time.timeend for shortest, for testable, for fastest, and for readable. The results are on the right over there, okay, as we ran them. So, and I did run multiple times. I wanted to make sure we came up right. And just one of the iterations that I ran, the shortest code, shortest number of characters, ran 1.079 milliseconds. It was the second slowest. If you look down at the bottom, readable, 1.717, almost 2 seconds. The most readable code was by far the slowest code. Our testable code actually came out pretty good, where we used the for each. Okay, 0.511 milliseconds. And fastest, our traditional for loop actually beat out testable just barely at 0.496 milliseconds. Okay, these are pretty fast runs with 100 million records, but we're not doing a lot either. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Take a look at the code next to our results. Okay, so shortest code. Okay, so here we saw in the shortest it ran about 1 second, and yes, this is the shortest number of lines. This is probably the shortest number of characters, and we can actually reduce that down a little bit more if we really wanted to be fancy with variables and things like that. Okay. Testable code. This code can be tested much easier than the others because I have full control over that comparison. I've pulled that comparison out, and I don't have to run through a full data set every time with the work.every and with the has username. I've separated that functionality. Makes it a lot easier to write unit tests. Okay. Fastest code. What's the fastest code? It is a little more complex than the previous 2. Okay. It doesn't take me long to figure out what's going on as I read through it. So we're setting a Boolean variable. We're looping through. We do have a break in the middle of that, so we have to figure out why we're breaking out. But it's quickest by far, right? So then we look at readable code. This is much more readable. Have equals true. Work for each item. If we have a username length that's 0, have is set to false. It loops through all the values, gets that, and returns whether it's true or false. Okay? That code's really readable. I mean, it's almost sentence form readable, good variables, things like that as well. Okay? So the whole point of looking at these 4 different types is this refactoring that we talked about early on. You know, we need to keep in mind that the shortest code is rarely the best. Okay, for challenges or to keep your skills sharp, shortest code is a good one to look at. Okay, testable code. Here we talk about having solid, reliable code. Okay. I have folks occasionally that will argue the point, you know, are unit tests worth having in place? Can we unit test the important parts? And quite often I've found that the places that I have to adjust my code are rarely where I expect it. So my guess as to what's important is rarely going to be right, is actually what I found. More tests, the better. You know, I always want to have those tests in place to have solid, reliable code. Fastest code. Okay, if we're running into optimization problems, if we have speed issues with our code, we might have to consider optimization and running some of that fastest code that's a little less readable, but gives us that performance boost. Okay, and readable code is quite often my first choice. Some combination of readable and testable is usually where we end up. Okay, some combination of 4. Those 4 should be all through the code base. If you're varying from which one you choose, because if you're doing performance and you want the shortest and fastest, there might be times when you want readable and testable. If you're primarily readable testable, there may be times when you want the shortest and fastest for particular areas. Okay? So some combination of these come into play. When it comes to refactoring code, understanding the 4 types and how you want to transform that code is important before you start that refactor. Okay. Wasn't a long chat here, but I really wanted to go through the 4 types of code, give you guys a rough idea of what's out there, what you can expect, and what kind of things to shoot for. You know, a lot of times when I'm looking at leak code or code wars or something like that, I'm quite often looking at, can I do this one of these 4 ways? And I come back to it later and try it another way. Same code challenge. But can I write the shortest? Can I write the testable? Can I write the fastest? Can I write the readable? Those are 4 completely different sets of code, as you saw. You know, challenge yourself, push yourself. That's all I'm saying here. Okay. So the 4 types of code, you know, the mentality came about, the concepts came about to me in terms of refactoring, talking to folks about refactoring code. Important things to keep in mind. Nothing huge, as you saw, it's a short talk, so enjoy it. Thanks for coming, thanks for listening. Talk to you all soon.